go ahead and get this thing started. Hello, everyone. My name is Nate Davis. I'm a program manager with RDI, and welcome to our great session of constructing sustainable and equitable rural economies. I hope you guys just got done watching that wonderful plenary with Leticia Gasca talking about how we can deal with constant states of change. And this session, I think, builds off of that really, really well and talks a little bit about looking into the future. When we're building rural economies into the future, how can we actually go about doing that? And so helping us introduce this panel and welcoming folks in is one of our board members, Eric Anderson. Eric Anderson is the president of SEDCOR, a nonprofit organization of business and community leaders committed to the economic vitality of Marion, Polk, and Yamhill counties. His time in RDI's board is coming to an end, and we're sad to see him go, but nonetheless, please welcome Eric Anderson.
Thank you, Nate. This is a good topic for us. I'm excited to be here, and we've got a great panel up ahead. The term economic development has many definitions and includes a variety of strategies. A community's economic development vision should be unique because not one size fits all. Many economic development models have proven to be environmentally unsustainable or have increased inequalities in our communities. This is especially true in rural areas where local control of resources may also be lost in the process. Rural economic development strategy should promote opportunities for environmental sustainability and local ownership. Cooperative models of business ownership may provide routes for communities seeking to reduce inequality, as well as provide business sustainability into the future. At SEDCOR, these topics are of great interest to us. We're about to launch a regional industry-led initiative that includes an entrepreneurship model where farmers and growers have equity stakes in new innovative businesses that are formed to solve challenges in growing, harvesting, and processing here in the Willamette Valley. So I'm really anxious to hear what our panelists have to say about other opportunities that we should be looking at in the future. This panel will address many of these opportunities and discuss in greater detail. First, we have Ernie Rasmussen. Ernie is currently the tribal liaison at the Washington State Department of Commerce. He has taken this role after long being a leader in tribal economic development, previously being the executive director of the Spokane Tribal Network and the senior planner for economic development for the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Next is Garrett Dalan. Garrett is nearly a lifetime resident of Western Washington. He works at the Nature Conservancy, and his work focuses on the intersection between fisheries, forestry, and economic development. And finally, we've got John McNamara on the panel. John is a senior cooperative development specialist with the Northwest Cooperative Development Center. His career has focused on the creation and conversion of existing businesses into cooperatives. He currently serves as chair of the Union Co-ops Council of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Please join me in welcoming the panel, and I will turn this back to Nate to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. So today we have a little bit of a unique format. I've been told to say innovative instead of unique, but we're going to be doing a mix of both questions to our panelists as well as presentations from our panelists. And so the first question that I have for our panelists is, what is not working currently in rural economies?
Nate, I'll take a stab at that right out of the gate. First, want to say a quick thank you to RDI for pulling us together and offering this opportunity to share our story. And I look forward to learning from the other presenters on the panel. And so thank you there. To answer the question, what's not working, I think we can safely say that going it alone in communities, really kind of taking this insular approach of, we're going to forge ahead and just nose to the grindstone and putting the shoulder into the wheel, that may have worked at a time and day, but we are now beyond that. We have to consider the strengths of our neighbors, the weaknesses of our neighbors, the opportunities and threats, within our environment, not only with our neighbors, but in our own internal communities, and begin to think strategically about how do we work within that greater environment and in a regional scale. This is all stuff that we really kind of already know, but oftentimes we overlook some of what our closest assets are. And that being for myself, the work that I've done, that being the neighboring tribal governments and how they can create value to your own efforts when you work closer with them. Thanks, Nate.
John, do you have any thoughts on the subject? What do you think are some of the challenges that are facing rural communities?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Ernie is saying, and also I think really well, thinking about how we want to do economic development. I was on a call early this morning about a lumber mill in central Wisconsin. It employed 900 people in a town of 18,000. So it also processed almost 75% of the lumber that is harvested in Wisconsin. So it was a really major operation, and it'd been around for over 100 years. And about 15 years ago, the family ran out of people who wanted to run it, and so they sold it to a company that sold it to a venture capital firm that sold it to another venture capital firm, and the last one just announced they closed the plant and it shut down. And the idea then is trying to find another venture capitalist firm to come in and restart the plant until they want to sell it to somebody else. And that sort of attracting outside investors really has limited value. And the original family had run it for over 100 years. And but as soon as it became on the market, it just started transferring ownership. And every time that happened, a little bit more of the company got peeled off and taken away. And so I think we definitely need to think about how to create the wealth and equity within the communities rather than trying to attract it and bring it in only to see it go to the next highest bidding town in a few years. Especially if you're using, I think taxpayer resources to try to attract that capital. It's much better to try to keep it within the community.
Appreciate that perspective, John. I feel like that's a really common trope that we see in a lot of rural communities, is that again and again and again, they keep pursuing business attraction, and traditional economic development tools generally say that we need to be looking for the next big business to come in and be able to promote growth in our communities. And that may not necessarily be sustainable across rural, especially over time. But I'm interested, Garrett, what your perspective on this might be.
Yeah, and to build on John a little bit, especially with that direct mill analogy, and thinking that most of the folks, I believe, participating in this conference are from the Northwest. And if we think the rural communities in the Oregon, Idaho, and Washington have a tendency to be pretty rich in natural resources. But I think we're letting too much of that value of the natural resource leave the community. And another way to put that maybe is that too little of the value chain is being realized locally. Coastal communities have an abundance of some resources, and I would say that even when they're managed sustainably, there's still an abundance. Simplest ones to think about are timber and fish, and there's others as well. And I'm not saying that not exporting is the solution, because we do have that abundance. So export can be a benefit. But I think we've grown, if that's the word to use there, over the decades to a place where we're exporting in effort for efficiency and then end up importing a very similar product back in while someone else has realized the gains of the processing of that product into its final state. And so I think that this puts actually more demand on our natural resources for the same amount of economic benefit or development that would happen if we look to create that value chain locally. And I think that that's, it's a little bit of a back to the future thing. And John's example, I don't remember the exact number you said, but some vast majority of the lumber was locally processed here at this mill. And so you had that, and we just keep moving further and further away from it. The old model of trying to take a product and see it through its life was how it worked for a long time. But now, as we've gotten to be able to be more efficient, I think we've sacrificed our rural economies for that efficiency.
There's definitely something to be said for how how economies tend to centralize and economies of scale tend to go against some of the basic things that have established some of these communities in the first place. And it may take looking at different models to be, or models that we have previously thought discarded and thought were old, to be able to rebuild some of these same spaces again. Ernie and John, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Nate, maybe you know, kind of leading into the this next presentation that I have, you know, the thought that, you know, in terms of tribes here in Washington State, in creating that partnership and the natural resources, you know, that these guys have mentioned, tribes in Washington State are collectively the 7th largest employer in the entire state. They've outperformed Costco as employers, outperformed Starbucks, outperformed Walmart, creating living wage jobs. 70% of those employees, as you know, the 7th largest employer in the state, are non-tribal members. They're non-tribal. So the economic impact of tribes across the greater region, in nearly every region that tribes exist, is they are the highest paying employer. They provide the highest, the best wage jobs, and have this tremendous economic impact. And on top of that, they provide that necessary, almost a reminder of, you know, what is important, as Eric had mentioned earlier, you know, that this is the model of economic extraction just is not sustainable. That, you know, they're stewards for the natural environment. They continue to advocate for their people and really all people. And so they offer that balance as employers and partners. And so that's what I would offer to that.
Yeah, and again, I think too, really trying to work with people and together, and not that go it alone approach. I'm thinking like, you know, last year I was doing some work in Ashland and in Talent, and was being told that a lot of the farmers just jumped into hemp because it was suddenly there and they wanted to be in on the market, but there wasn't anything to produce hemp with. So they ended up with a lot of raw material that just sat in warehouses, and the price crashed. And I think, you know, it's thinking about having that strategic community discussion about what infrastructure do you have and what do you need before making big changes.
It's interesting to see how these things are interconnected. Ernie, would you like to take a deeper dive and talk a little bit about, maybe pull up your presentation and talk a little bit more about how this connects?
Sure. All right, great. So as you know, as you picked up, you know, as the tribal liaison for the Washington State Department of Commerce, and framing it within this discussion about, you know, what can rural economies look like, you know, creating identifying a natural partnership and then finding a way to create value within that partnership that can produce, again, that sustainability that we seek within our economies. So this photo here, you know, what you're seeing is actually the early beginnings of the town of Nespelem, which is a Washington State municipality. Can't give you the exact date on this, but it's in north central Washington and it's on the Colville Reservation. Part of my work is to work within those municipalities and help bridge that relationship between the municipality, which maybe in this case actually has a Native American mayor, a Native American town council. It resides within the reservation, and we work to create a partnership between the tribe and the municipality to have effective use of resources, whether those are financial resources, human resources, or, you know, even natural resources. So let's move on to the next slide. And so we've already seen, you know, what Eric had mentioned, or we've heard mention of it in this idea of this sustainability paradigm, where there's an equal balance of society, nature, and economy. But what we've also come to realize here most recently is the economy seems to be the main focus of just about everything we've been doing over the past, you know, almost 100 years in many cases. and it's dwarfed, you know, the societal element of it, and nature gets put into the backseat. And then we have other factions where sometimes nature pushes back, you know, the environmental groups, and say that that's important, you know. And in the civic unrest that we've experienced in the summer of 2020, we're seeing the societal element push back and say that's important too. And so we're in this kind of wrestling match between the environmental aspect, the societal aspect, and the economic aspect, and we're seeing a real struggle at this point. So the Native American paradigm really does work to try and achieve balance in all of that. I want to call out on this, on the lower left-hand side of the, you know, within the drought status and hydroelectric dam reservoir storage, where it says Grand Coulee, you know, Lake Roosevelt and Grand Coulee, right below September 1, 2020. So we're going to look at that again later. Moving on here. So really, how do you get to that point where you have that relationship with a tribe? And it's not, it's sometimes it feels like you can't just show up and start talking about, hey, the economic benefit of things. You've got to remember that, you know, the values for tribes are different than that economic focus. They have an environmental focus, a societal focus, and what maybe their cultural resources, and then of course an economic element to what they're trying to do. And I would encourage everybody to really kind of look at the model of engaging tribes in the framework of the 3 R's. And it's about the relationship and finding out what is common, and that we have a common interest in the community in this rural area. And then as you get to know folks and as you get to spend time with them, you can get to the point where you can ready to take that next step of respect and learning to appreciate what those differences are. I kind of think about it in times of like almost getting into a relationship, a marriage, where, you know, my wife and myself, when we first got together, we found what was common between us, and we learned, you know, that this is a great thing that we've got going on. And as, you know, we found out what our differences were, well, I learned to appreciate those differences in my wife. I learned to appreciate the differences in my friends and in the community that I live in. And then at some point you get to the point of reciprocity where you can give back to each other. You have something to offer to each other because you each bring different strengths to the equation. And those within that equation, now all of a sudden you have this diversity-based equation for doing things in a very productive way. So the 3 R's are really critically important. Again, this is not my work. This is the work of Linda to Hawaii Smith, who's an indigenous scholar for the Maori. So when we start talking about a little bit of, you know, that work, sometimes it requires that you do a little bit of inventory of like what your own perceptions are, what your own biases are. And for, you know, sometimes you have to kind of go through what we call a decolonization process, and an understanding that tribes have an interest beyond the borders of their reservation. Up here in north central Washington, where I am, you know, the Colville Reservation is this well, it's actually 1.4 million acres, about the size of the state of Delaware. And it exists, you know, in north central Washington. Well, their usual and accustomed territories are actually extend much further beyond, all the way in from northern Oregon to southern British Columbia. The relocation and compression of these 12 tribes into that 1.4 million acre area, they still have a desire to work beyond those borders, to have an existence, to engage in commerce beyond the borders of their current reservation. And so tribes will often spend time seeking out those opportunities in metropolitan areas, even in some of the rural areas, looking at what are some of the opportunities for folks for them to engage in commerce. And so they're looking for those partners. And so this gives you an idea of like what it might look like. If we build out from that idea of the, you know, current reservation status of 1.4 million acres, and you think about the reservation that's near you, and you think about the usual and accustomed territories that go far beyond the reservation, and then you start thinking, okay, if I applied that to all reservations and all tribes, I get into a really kind of what Indian country is, and it's the entire country. And all of a sudden you see there's an interest by tribes throughout the country. Not only is there an interest, but there's an opportunity to engage tribes. There's an opportunity for you to bring a new partner into your equation that lends to that diversity and richness that can create a robustness to whatever your economic development plans are. If we don't bring them forward, and I mentioned earlier, the Cooley Dam reference, and that image on the far upper right-hand corner are the chiefs of the Colville Reservation, of those bands, those 12 bands of the Colville Reservation. Seeing the construction of Cooley Dam, fully calling out attention that it does not have fish passage to it, that there is no fish passage, that the last salmon that was ever going to go up the Columbia River, at least in their lifetime, was gone. They would never see another salmon go beyond that. And that was an incredible disruption to their economy and every economy upstream from that. And so, again, if we don't have an effective partnership to bring equitable voice to the table, we run into situations where we really can have a detrimental effect, not only to our own economies, but the environment and to that third element of society. When we do create that opportunity for people to engage, we end up with just rich projects that really reflect and resonate just a whole new identity for the region. And I often say that the state of Washington, really the Pacific Northwest, Native American people are so critically important to the identity of the people that live here today. The artwork is everywhere. The culture is celebrated and welcomed. It becomes really a big part of who we are here in the Pacific Northwest. And so reaching out again and thinking about how you can bring those folks in closer to your own communities and your own economic development plans is really something that really you could just think of as being ultimately it's a strength. So thank you, Nate.
Thank you, Ernie. I really appreciate that perspective. I appreciate bringing in the tribal perspective of how we really need to be looking at economy. And it's the same as this triple bottom line perspective of there's the economic sphere, and that's one sphere where we've obviously put a lot of effort and money and focus into, but there's also these social and environmental spheres that are equally important. And we really see the detriment of when we ignore those at the expense of just looking at economic growth, which is why with RDI, I'm always glad that we focus more on economic vitality rather than economic development, looking at it in a little bit more holistic manner, incorporating some of those other spheres. But I do want to ask as a follow-up question to that, and maybe Garrett, you can help me with this, is what do we want out of this? Like, we know there are challenges in regards to the way that we look at economy building, where we're overly focused on the economy side of things. But what is the grand goal, and what do we actually want to see, and what should we be pursuing?
I think, looking forward at a rural economy, there's key components to it for sure. And, Ernie touched into some of those opportunities. We talked a little bit about it earlier. I think is maybe an overarching look that these rural communities need to try to strive for an economy that's dynamic with identity. And so the dynamic part of that, I would say that there's a variety of business types. There's a variety of business structures included in the rural economy, and that can create some independence in a unique way and with that resiliency, certainly a great term right now. There's also, I think, that makes it more inviting, that if there is more of a dynamic, then other businesses, other ideas, entrepreneurs feel more kind of welcome in getting something started with that, which then just kind of builds on to those dynamics. And it does create some resiliency in the sense that if there is a key industry that suffers, that doesn't drag the entire economy down with it. And so there's that dynamic part of it, but then you don't want, I don't think they want to lose the identity. And that identity is going to be unique to the different communities. And it may not be singular either. There might not be a single identity for a community, but it's that identity that in the community that creates the passion and the agency of what they have going there, of their economy in this conversation. You know, those things are often built around the identity. And I don't think that the rural economy should sacrifice their identity to build their economy. I think they want to strive to try to build their economy around their identity and recognizing that they do want to be more dynamic. So a fishing town can be a fishing town, but they should also look to have restaurants in their town serving fish, and that maybe the consumers, the patrons of that restaurant are your government employees and they're your teleworkers that are in the tech industry, because they can be in the rural economy now too. And just kind of celebrating and embracing the fact that you can have a diverse community with identity, and that's probably going to be a great strength moving forward.
I love that, Garrett. Ernie, can you pull that in and talk a little bit about what you see for the future and this idea of identity? If you could maybe expand upon that and see how does that connected to some of the work that you've done?
I think it's it's really part of some of the angst that we're going through right now is especially in rural communities here, is that identity is being challenged. It's feeling like it's being, in times, we're being imposed with a new identity, or you know, that you have to accept something that you don't want to. And so that's that part of that pushback that we're seeing. I'd love the idea that, you know, rural communities really want to retain their rural character. That's ultimately, that's part of the reason why you live in rural places. And so identifying what it is that creates that uniqueness about your community and protecting it, championing it, putting it into a position where it, you know, it becomes almost a premium value in your community, that becomes almost your beacon for moving forward. I also like really what Garrett said about, you know, looking at different structures for doing business. While that identity may be, you know, that we are rural in nature, we also have to be flexible enough to understand that for our identity to survive, and this is true within Native American communities, it's been true for, you know, God, since 1492, we've had to learn to adapt. So this is true of all rural communities. We need to learn to adapt to a new opportunity for, if there's a new way of doing business, and if that means, you know, an ESOP or a co-op or employee-owned type of structure, where we are engaged in community wealth building and keeping wealth local, that's something that I think is critically important for us to not just turn our back on and say, well, that's not who we are. You know, we need to become a bit more adaptive to what those opportunities are, especially if we want to retain that rural identity.
John, I imagine you have a unique perspective on this, coming from cooperative development and one between dynamism and also looking at it from a adaptive or identity standpoint. Maybe you can share a couple examples of what you've seen and what you've envisioned for the future.
Yeah, you know, it's thinking about the dynamic and identity, I think, is really important. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about it later, but you know, I think that places that are really conducive to being human, right? And when I mean that, it's you know, thinking about the co-op values and goals, which I'll talk more about in my presentation, but they basically correlate with this concept of human dignity and what that means, and solidarity, and that, you know, creating places that that not necessarily that everyone wants to flock to, but the people that are there are meeting their needs and finding the ability to thrive, and where people aren't really shut out of the discussion, where everyone in that community has the same ability to thrive and to grow and to become who they you know want to become. You know, one of the larger worker co-ops in the world is Mondragon Co-op in the Basque region of Spain, and it was started in a very small industrial town in the Pyrenees Mountains called Mondragon, and that's what it was all about. And the priest who kind of led the families of the mill workers to start the process always talks about how the purpose of cooperation is to and of the work through cooperation is to help people become more human. And I think that's, to me, has always resonated with me. And so, when I see that, I see, like, I worked in a taxi cab company for too many years, 26 years. And, that's a very blue collar job, but we literally saw people who, came to us who were literally homeless or who were having other structures in their life. And because of our structure, they're able to grow and prosper and buy homes. And, I remember one woman, she came on the lot one day. She was like 64 years old, and it was the first car she had ever owned. And she was driving it with a big smile on her face. And, she had worked hard her whole life, but never really had the ability to enjoy her life till she was in an environment that gave back to her that way. And, we all deserve that.
Really good. Yeah, I appreciate the wide variety of response and like how this vision changes. And I think a big part of, why we're doing this virtually right now is because of COVID. And obviously the future is very unknown right now. And I'm wondering, with being in such a world of change, how do we think things like COVID are going to influence what the future is going to look like, particularly when it comes to a rural economy? Graham, none of you have a crystal ball, but I'd love to hear what any of you guys would think.
If I can jump in, I would say in addition to COVID, there's also, of course, the response to the fires. And, towns like Phoenix and Talent were completely wiped out. They were a major place of affordable housing for farm workers and for seniors in the communities between Medford and Ashland. And the businesses also got wiped out with them. In fact, one of our projects this year was to work with a cafe in Talent, and it's gone. And so it's thinking about how to rebuild these economies that really are literally going to have to rise out of the ashes. And it's kind of a clean slate right now. There's a lot of opportunity there. But it's also going to be a challenge. I think, so I'm thinking in that sense, it's not just COVID, but it's the combined effort of both. And I think the biggest thing is to say what was working or what we were doing wasn't necessarily working to begin with. And the twin disasters have just really made that even more obvious.
Ernie, it looked like you had thoughts.
Well, I just want to echo John's thoughts there on, the wildfires and here in North Central Washington, we had our own experiences with wildfire and it completely razed a mill site. And so that mill site is now gone, and it's forcing us to reimagine how that mill site would look. And so in some ways it's, I know the COVID crisis it's tragic for some. The wildfire crisis has been tragic for some. And absolutely recognizing that, but also looking at, a bit of a silver lining in some of this. COVID has given us an opportunity to slow down and reflect on what is not working, and what can it look like? How can we reimagine and rebuild? Similarly so with the wildfire. We have the crisis response, but as we've seen, they're actually those communities that had plans to guide them through crises are actually able to respond in a more resilient manner. They've got something to come back to and guide them through their next steps. And so I want to thank John for bringing that up about the wildfires.
I think that's a good transition. Garrett, would you like to talk a little bit more in depth about where you see the future going, and kind of discuss a little bit of the work that you've been doing at EcoTrust?
Yeah, and see, now I have to call you out, Nate. I've given you a few seconds there, but you got the wrong NGO.
Oh, I am so sorry.
No, that's fine. EcoTrust does do similar stuff too. Certainly, our colleagues at EcoTrust have different plans than what I'm going to talk about. But trying to find that that nexus between nature and people and economy. And certainly, with the Nature Conservancy, I think over the last couple of decades, organizationally, some maybe more robustly than others, have realized that you can't have nature thrive in its own little protective bubble, because if the people aren't thriving along with it, then there's going to be resistance to those to that conservation work and to those natural solutions. And I do think that that's getting more and more widely accepted. And so you do see multiple organizations trying to take creative ways to approach this. On the Washington coast, where my work is centered, we do that through a group we're calling the Innovation Network. And that's just a group of rural community members from along the coast who are getting together to try to work through problems systemically, collaboratively, and experimentally. And that's how we think you can tackle complex social and dynamic challenges. So the Innovation Network supports leadership and people and projects that can create system change to improve the resilience of local economies. It brings together regional partners, tries to strengthen those economic systems with localized wealth, sustainable natural resources. We focus on projects that can tackle these persistent challenges by seeking maybe a path not taken, and certainly learning from our failures, right? That experimental approach. You're not trying to plan your way to perfection. You're trying to learn quickly and try to make some changes. One of those projects that we're working with is Community Catch. And Community Catch is aiming to create a complete fisheries market, that being a dynamic economic chain, not a place where you go to buy fish. A fisheries market local to the Washington coast that increases the economic impact of, let's say, not yet popular sustainably caught fish species. And again, as a way to increase the economic resiliency of these coastal communities. So I'll dive in. I didn't put the numbers on a slide. I'll try to highlight them a little bit for you. We'll muddle through some math here. But as an example of what the potential is for a project like this, again, Washington has a very robust and also a very rich fisheries resource, right? That's been the economic and sustaining source for the coastal communities, both in the last several centuries and then with the indigenous communities going back forever before that. If you take the CDC's guidelines, which is 8 ounces of fish per week, and we were able to get 25% of the people who live along the Washington coast to do that. We'll round that number to 200,000. You can find that depending on how far you reach into the communities. If you got 25% of them to follow that guidelines, that'd be about 1.3 million pounds of fillets consumed a year. If those fish were caught and processed and distributed and retailed locally, and you sold it for a low mark of $5 a pound, which I think is about the going rate of hamburger right now. But if you sold those fillets for $5 a pound, that would be $6.5 million of economy, totally local impact there, right? That's only a quarter of the people following the minimum guidelines. Another way to look about it, I did these in reverse. I buried the headline, should have gone with the bigger number second. But another way to take advantage of that is that there are over 3 million visitors to Olympic National Park. So the Washington coastal communities, in a roundabout way, kind of wrap Olympic National Park. If 2% of those visitors ate a meal of fish at a restaurant, that's another probably $600,000 right there, just in fish value going back, not in full restaurant value, just in the value that the restaurant, the distributor, the processor, the fisherman realized from those sales. And that's going to need about 3.5 million pounds of whole fish caught to land in the fillets that land to get to that $7 million, right? And I also want to share like that this is a sustainable thing to do. We worked with a small team called Marfish Eco, and they're kind of scattered literally around the world in their team members, but they did a market analysis for us, which we're just completing and finishing up. And what that found was it analyzed, part of it was analyzing fish species and availability. And so if we're thinking again that those two little numbers I gave you, if we needed to get to 3.5 million pounds of fish, that sounds like a tremendous amount of fish. A couple numbers to learn. Washington lands over 160 million tons of seafood a year. So it's a super huge number. And let's take two species, short spine thorny head. We may not know what that fish is. It's a decent sized ground fish in the round, not a flatfish. If we harvested that fish to only half its sustainable level, there is 1.6 million pounds to be had in that one species. And that's only harvesting it to half its sustainable level. If we take its cousin, the long spine thorny head, which is a smaller one, but also commercially available, and we again harvest it, these are using 2018 numbers, but if we harvest it to half its sustainable fishing limit, that's 4.5 million pounds. And that's only two species of dozens of available species. So this is absolutely a sustainable opportunity. And I just gave two examples, right? Trying to get retail for locals, trying to get the high-end tourist market. There's schools, we could get fish into schools. That's a tremendous number of consumptions just in the coastal communities. If you then branch out to the entire state, those numbers kind of get mind-boggling. If you look at other public institutions like hospitals and prisons that serve food 3 meals a day, every day, our local fish are not there. And our local fish aren't even in restaurants locally. And so just again, trying to create this whole value chain. Community Catch looks at fish. There are very similar things in the forestry market. High level, super fast example on that. September surveys from the State Department of Natural Resources in Washington State of mills landed at an average for a good alder log coming in that the mills are paying about $600 for every 1,000 board feet coming in. So that's 60 cents a board foot. I went on Wayfair recently and I found a bed frame made entirely of alder, save for the brass fasteners and brackets. That alder, by the time Wayfair sold it, was over $18 a board foot. So if somebody wants to do math real quick, that's a 3,000 market increase. And so, our coastal communities, are we giving up 3,000% of our natural resource potential? Now that's a beautiful one to highlight, and we're not going to fill the world with bed frames coming out of Washington alder. But I think that can kind of kick a couple numbers up that just shows like what the potential is there. And then, to tug down on my TNC hat a little more firmly, if you can make more from each fish or each log, you need fewer fish and fewer logs to be harvested to reach your sustainability, to reach your resilience, hey, let's jump for prosperity, let's jump to wealth. And there's still the natural resources here to do it if we do it in a really strategic and impactful way.
Garrett, thank you so much for that presentation. I appreciate you and the Nature Conservancy's work on this. And I love the perspective though, that we can change our paradigm around sustainability and equity and all these other issues that we care about. That these are not just pie in the sky things, but they're actual steps that we can take forward to reach these outcomes and to be able to create a balance between economy, sustainability, and society as a whole. And so I want to throw it back at the panel again, starting with John probably. What do we think are some of those first steps that we can take to be able to get back to having balance between these three spheres of society?
I think for the first thing I would say is that there's not going to be a cookie cutter approach. Every community is going to have its uniqueness, and actually every sector is going to be different. To just by way of an example, we work with manufacturer housing communities to transition them into cooperatives. And one of our first big projects was in Moses Lake, where we had 3 parks with the same owner that were within a mile of each other. And we thought, oh, this is great, economies of scale. And it ended up being 3 times the work because each community had its own culture and we didn't have any savings. Keeping in mind that it's a very human process, and this goes back to that identity and uniqueness that, but then I think it's focusing on the needs. So what do the community, what are their real needs of the community? And what resources do they have to meet those needs, or what do they need to develop and create? And then, understanding that, as a rule, profit-oriented markets tend to ignore the rural economy. And, we see that with electricity historically, right? So the electric co-ops stepped in because otherwise the rural communities weren't going to get electrified. And we're seeing that today with broadband. I mean, again, the electric co-ops are now stepping up and getting permission to offer broadband to their communities because otherwise it's simply unaffordable. And so I think, thinking about, again, what are the resources that already exist? Like we already have the electric co-ops in many communities, and so they're a natural thing. And then what do people need? And then what are the new opportunities and technologies that are out there that we can go with? And so, I think I can stop there for now and see what other people bring in.
Well, you won't let you get ahead of yourself, but Ernie, I'm sure you're more than familiar with both the challenges, the gaps that exist that people have to be able to overcome, as well as some of the solutions that are being pursued. And I'd be interested to hear your perspective on what we can do.
Garrett's example is of local wealth, the local development of the local value chain. I think it's again that example of what I mentioned in the opening of, and then what John has just echoed is that the need for a plan that understands, your strengths along with your weaknesses, along with your neighbor's strengths and their weaknesses, and how do you work in coordination with each other so that you can keep that wealth local, so you can develop that local value chain, to put yourself into a position of strength, resiliency, and not so dependent on far-reaching places and resources that are not close. Absolutely, we can't meet every need in our own backyard, but we should try and do everything we can to meet as many of those needs as we can as possible. And that doesn't, while John said there is no cookie cutter approach to each community is going to have its own unique strengths and weaknesses, its own unique identity. I think what can be utilized from community to community is the planning approach to developing what is your focus, what is your mission, what is your focus, and what is it that so I'm a planner, so I almost overemphasize the importance of the planning profession, but at the same time, it works. And when it's done well, it can create that backbone to guide you through those times of crisis. And again, bring you back to where your center and give you a place to relaunch. So Garrett's example was great, and John just wrapped it up. So I'm happy to add to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ernie. Yeah, I love that. The importance of planning, and then also this idea of like a collective impact in one way or another, that you're able to identify community needs and then be able to plan things to be able to meet those needs in one way or another. Garrett, I'm curious, with the projects that you were mentioning, the examples that you were mentioning, how did those things come about? Like, how did those communities, how did they capitalize on some of those pieces of wealth that they had?
Yeah, it's still in the planning phases. We haven't been able to I shouldn't say, we're not to the point of implementing these, right? We are in design and we're trying to do that very collaboratively. And that can be it can slow you down sometimes. At least it will feel that way in the developing or planning process, but that's what's going to make it work long term, right? I was thinking the analogy that there's not going to be a cookie cutter for everybody, but you're going to get your cookie cutter out of a collaborative drawer, right? That there's going to be, if we work together, then there's enough cutters in there to make a cookie everybody likes. And the other part that I guess I've got two other things that kind of ring and like what communities should keep in mind as we're trying to tackle this. And one is don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Go out and try something and learn from it. And I gathered two conflicting perspectives here. I found a quote attributed to Confucius. I don't know if that's true, but that's what the internet told me. That better a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without. And so that's the wise man. And then my friend in Forks, Washington, gave me the quote of, "We never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity." And I think that, that's where rural communities are sometimes is there's always some reason not to do something. And so there's always a flaw. You can always find a flaw, and so then not do it. And then you do end up kind of missing those opportunities. And one way that I think I would kind of highlight on that is, I think we want to remember to view cost differently. If we kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of the economy, it's really easy to be like, well, what's your revenue? What's your cost? There's your profit. But dive deeper into that cost, because if that cost is Ernie, to build on Ernie's example, if that cost is your neighbor's strength and you're paying your neighbor because they're really good at that, is that really a cost in that equation? Should that be considered a cost in your equation to land at your profits? Because your neighbor's maybe going to turn around and return that to you in an investment of some type. That's a very simple way to look at it. It would be more complex, but certainly I think rural communities want to make sure they're not looking at every cost the same, and there could be some strength there.
Yeah, I like the perspective of we need to incorporate the full cost of doing things and being able to recognize, one, that some things that we recognize as financial costs may actually be a benefit to a community as a whole, but then also that within some costs may be unseen by the person who's paying the price, but may exist to the system as a whole. And when we're building things up, we need to be cognizant and aware of those kinds of challenges and issues. And so I want to throw it back to John, and I want him to talk a little bit about the work that he's been doing in terms of being able to build cooperatives and what are some of the big benefits that can come for our rural community that might be interested in doing something like that with some of their businesses that exist.
Okay, let me get my slides up and so from let's get this, there we go. Okay, so right, I work, as I mentioned, with the Northwest Cooperative Development Center, and we pretty much work on cooperatives. That's what we do. We help people start cooperatives, and we help people with cooperatives improve them, and we work across the board with housing and worker co-ops, producer co-ops. I'm going to go through a little bit and just kind of give a little bit of a background on cooperatives for those that may not be as familiar with them, and then talk a little bit more about how this can work in the community. But first, I want to talk about something that's really becoming or is front and center right now, and has been exacerbated by of course, COVID, and that is what we call the silver tsunami. So the majority of small businesses in the United States are owned by people who were born in the baby boom era, so 1946 to 1964, who are rapidly approaching age 65 and up. And so as they're getting near their retirement age, they may or may not have somebody to take over the business. In fact, it's estimated that only 15% of existing small businesses will transfer to the next generation of ownership, and only 20% will find a buyer. So that means that roughly 2/3 of the small businesses that exist today will likely just simply close at one point. And and also, of course, added to this is most owners don't have a succession plan. I mentioned the lumber mill in Wisconsin, and that was part of it. They were basically expecting the next generation to take over, and when the next generation didn't want to, they suddenly had no plan, and they had to find somebody to buy the mill. So that's a real risk right now. It's the biggest generational change of capital in the history of the world, and it's happening here in Canada, across the country. So Project Equity, which is a group that we work with, they've done some numbers and research, and you can go to the website there and you can actually drill down to the counties. But to give an example, in Washington, about 56,000 businesses are owned by people in the baby boom era, and with almost 600,000 employees and 21 billion in payroll. Oregon and Idaho have similar numbers. This is a huge, huge moment in our history. And of course, added to this is COVID-19, right? And what this is doing is that it's forcing some of these decisions to close. So I didn't have time to really look at the numbers, but there are a number of businesses that have closed down because of the pandemic that will just simply never reopen. Many of these, of course, will be hospitality and service jobs, but also a number of retail operations too. And you can see it probably in many towns. I know when I even go downtown in Olympia today, you can see businesses that are going to be vacant. And so this also, though, is a huge opportunity because there are potential buyers for these stores, and it's the people who work there. Obviously, not every business is going to be able to transition, but they can do that. And so they can do this by doing it as a cooperative. It can be a worker-owned cooperative, and I'll talk a little bit later about also a community-owned cooperative. But cooperatives, they exist specifically to meet the needs of the community that it serves. So most of you might be familiar with food co-ops. They're owned by the consumers usually, and they are specifically there to provide that community with access to good food. Credit unions are a financial form of cooperative that offer banking services and the like. They all operate under this international concept that we call the cooperative identity. It's a set of values and principles that I pulled out just some of them here that I think really resonate with rural communities that I find. So one is about mutual self-help, that it's members of the community coming together to help each other, but also self-responsibility and solidarity, and really where the community is engaged both with everyone taking responsibility for themselves, but also for helping their neighbors do the same. Cooperatives are entirely based on the concept of democracy. The USDA, which does a lot of funding of co-op development in rural communities, talks about the user principles, where the owners of the co-op are the ones who use its goods or services. The co-op members, the users of the co-op, also control the co-op democratically, and the users are the ones who benefit from the success of the co-op. And it's all done in a democratic one member, one vote. So this means basically that regardless of how much you might have invested in the co-op or how much in a worker co-op, whether you work 40 hours a week or 8 hours a week, you still have one vote. You still get to have one vote in the say of how the business goes. And of course, again, this is about equality and equity, that people are treated and have a fair share and a fair voice. Also, they tend to be really focused on independence and autonomy. So, and this kind of comes out into not getting into complicated business arrangements, or making sure if they do enter into a relationship with another organization or a community, that it's very clear on what the different rights and responsibilities are for each of the parties in that agreement, so that they don't become basically a subsidiary of some larger organization that can make decisions that don't reflect the will of the community that they serve. And then lastly, a big part of it is about concern for community. And you see that also in their values of social responsibility, caring for others. That co-ops tend to be really focused on being good stewards of the land and water, of really caring for the people who work in their cooperatives and being good neighbors in their town. You often see them supporting a lot of work and striving to be as best they can. I want to just give a really quick history. So the first co-op in the United States was formed by Ben Franklin, and it was an insurance company in 1752 to help people in Philadelphia come back after fires. So everyone would pitch in, and it was not done for profit. It was, co-ops tend to operate on a what I call a cost basis. So they try to figure out what that break-even point is, and that includes what it's going to cost to replace capital, and then and that's really what they're looking for. They're not looking to maximize profit. They're just looking to cover their expenses, and including replacing whatever equipment they'll need to replace, and meeting then the needs of the community. So Ben Franklin kind of got things kicked off in this country. In the UK, the most famous one is the Rochdale Co-op in the 1840s that began a grocery store that specialized in selling unadulterated food, which is kind of an interesting thing about the Industrial Revolution, but I don't want to dwell on that. And for us in the rural areas, though, the really big movement came in the 1880s. So the Grange and the Knights of Labor both were active in creating co-ops. The Grange was focused mostly on agricultural co-ops, and the Knights of Labor were aimed at creating worker cooperatives. One of the long-lasting co-ops of the area was in Astoria, Oregon. The Union Fishermen's Co-op was founded in 1895 and really lasted all the way until the mid-50s. I think Bumblebee was the last of the ones to leave Astoria, but they were second. So they provided a lot of jobs and decent work for the community. And then, of course, the ag co-ops really kicked into gear. So Dairygold, Tillamook have been around for almost 100 years. But more importantly, in the last 10 years, the worker co-op movement has really come on strong. And most importantly, in 2018, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act was passed in Congress. And this act gives the Small Business Administration a specific mandate to assist businesses to convert to worker-owned businesses, either as employee stock-owned programs, which are really more of an insurance program than what we would think of as a co-op, or worker co-ops where the workers buy the company and own it. Likewise, the small business development centers that are throughout our communities, they also have the mandate to support the transition of businesses in their communities to worker ownership. So some of the benefits here are that, for one, the businesses, instead of disappearing from their communities and everything that means, can secure new owners, and the existing owners can actually retire. They can safely retire. They can get the equity out of their business that might otherwise be lost or reduced to a going out of business sale level. So, and then secondly, that business will maintain its legacy in the community. It'll be there pretty much as long as there's a market for what they're doing. And especially for businesses that might really create part of that local identity, I think this is really one of the more important things, that losing the business that has kind of defined your downtown can be devastating to the morale of the community as well. For the owners, or for the workers, they also get job security. They get a voice in operations. Usually they are able to translate that owner share of the business into higher wages or compensation. Sometimes it might just be that they're able to simply work less or not work as hard. This is more of an urban example, but I talked with a cab driver in Denver, and they had bought their company, and the difference was they had to lease their vehicle for the week, and the difference in their lease rate was $500 a week once they took over the company, which is about $25,000 a year. So you can see big changes when the workers gain ownership. Also, there's a tendency for workers to actually increase their productivity and to to actually make changes that make the business stronger. And then the community, of course, absolutely benefits a lot. Not only do they keep that legacy business in place, but retain jobs. But more importantly, worker co-ops, and I think any co-op really engages with the community in a different way. And so you create this community wealth where you have suddenly like a group of employees suddenly become business leaders, and they start learning how to become good practitioners of democracy. And it's not uncommon to see people who start getting involved in co-ops to then go out and serve on city committees and even run for local office. So there's a lot of kind of intangible benefits as well. There are some other models. So I mentioned resident-owned communities. That's where the owners, the residents actually buy the property, and then so the co-op kind of rents to the renters, but the renters own the co-op. We worked with a group in Klatskin that uses a mesh technology to create internet service. So it's a little bit different than broadband. It's line of sight shared antennas, and they literally create a web. So every house that has a antenna connects to the other antennas, and they are able to expand out. And then what we call multi-stakeholder co-ops today, we call them solidarity co-ops. And I should say, and one example that we just worked on this year is in Olympia. A bookstore was going out of business. The staff were not going to be able to take it over by themselves. So they reached out to the community, and 550, 600 people in the community who loved the bookstore came in and joined the bookstore, and they were able to transition to a community, a solidarity co-op where the workers have an ownership stake. There's a consumer ownership stake, and then there's a low income ownership stake. But the common traits of all of this is that you have community ownership and control. And again, the money stays local, and it gives people a reason to stay in that community, and it actually builds excitement. It's very often that people in co-ops will start other co-ops, so they'll take that to the next level. Like we worked with the construction co-op in Olympia, and after a couple of years, a couple of people split off to do a painting co-op, and it starts feeding on itself. Once you get a couple going in a community and people see they succeed, it becomes something exciting. In Olympia, we had 2 worker co-ops in 2012. Today, we have almost a dozen. So it really can be an exciting model. I just want to say a couple things. Businesses do have to be stable. Businesses that's at the crisis mode and is going to be really hard. The timeline to turn things over is usually 6 to 18 months. You have to have a willing seller. You definitely need some folks trained in business development to help. And again, SBDCs can now help folks with that. And then basically kind of go through this pretty good process. There's a group called Worker to Owners that has really scoped this out nationally, and it's a pretty straight up process on how to go. So what communities can do is you can actually identify your legacy businesses, local needs again, do some succession planning workshops in the community. Don't wait until people are tired and want to retire to start talking about succession planning, getting local governments to also talking about that, and starting to think about which are the businesses that your community really needs, and then try to figure out ways to keep that community going. And so, yep, I'll just leave it there. I kind of took more time than I thought I was going to take. I apologize.
John, that was great. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for doing that. I like co-ops is an idea that I've always had a lot of affinity for. Just this idea in rural places, people get a little bit, they lose a sense of ownership of their community. They lose a sense of ownership in the work that they do, and at least a worker co-op allows people to take a little bit more of a piece. But so I really appreciate you being able to speak on that. So we're going to take a little bit of time for Q&A. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please enter them into the chat, and we will go through them one by one. We already have one question in from Noah, and I believe this one is geared directly at John. Noah's question for John is, how can we foster more of this conversation around co-ops in Oregon, along with the unique technical assistance experiences needed at scale to support it?
So one thing, and I saw in the chat mentioned our legacy project. We do have a set of videos that we did a little traveling roadshow a couple years ago. We really think that the best way to reach out to business owners is to find the people that they talk to for advice. So whether that's people who are retirement planners or attorneys or accountants that are helping them with their taxes, those are the folks that I think can really be helpful in getting that out there. I think you know, the SBDCs are starting to learn about how to do this, and we're always, you know, we say we're happy to come in and do where we can help. We don't feel we always have to be the group to do it. We're happy to offer advice and to help. We want to train the SBDC professionals and attorneys and lawyers into how to do co-op development. And so we're always a resource to be reached out to, but we would love nothing more than to see another development center open up in Oregon, for instance. So I think it's finding the professional advisors that they're already on the ground and already giving advice to get this as another tool in their toolkit.
Another question for you, John. Are there any types of businesses that seem most ripe for co-op formation in rural communities?
You know, I would say definitely retail outlets. You know, things that again I would say, you know, retail works because, especially if it's a retail that really serves that community, because then you have the consumer base that might also be part of the ownership structure. And of course, you know, the hospitality and service, there's a strong tradition of worker-owned cafes and such. I would say some of the things that might be a little bit more difficult are businesses that are, you know, sort of one-person shops where it's just really the owner is doing 95% of the work. That might be a little bit difficult, although it can always, you know, to transition. And professional, the more professional you get, there might be some licensing issues. But
all right, so we have another question. I think this one is also for John. I've been trying to do, this is from Christine. I've been trying to do research on starting a community-owned general store in my area. I would love a little information on setting up the system and the laws regarding this model. Maybe is there anywhere that she could find more information, or just kind of general summary?
So there's an organization based out of Minneapolis that specifically works with food co-ops, and they might also be, a lot of their process will be similar to grocery or to general store. It's called the Food Co-op Initiative, and I think fci.coop is their website. They have kind of a nice planner book that you can download for free, and it can really take you through the steps of trying to start a retail store and give you a great starting point. And then of course we can always provide a number of other tools as well.
Another one that sounds fairly similar for John is I'm thinking about agricultural producers in our area. Farmers and ranches here across, as well as across the country, average age 58, and noted a few of their kids want to take on the land. Are there examples of farms operated as co-ops, especially when we think about raising up the next generation of food producers?
Yeah, that's a relatively new development that's happening. There's a farm worker co-op in outside Cincinnati in Southern Ohio. The University of Wisconsin Center for Co-ops, they've done some research on it and have actually created some documents on how to start them. We're working with a couple in Thurston County as well. So I can't point to any that are really, I think Our Harvest is one that is kind of a solidarity co-op where it's the farm workers are members, but you also have a CSA members who are also part of it. And they're, I think, outside of Portland. I'm not sure exactly where they are, but they're they're in Oregon. And the UW Center for Co-op has a paper on farm worker co-ops that can be pretty useful for thinking about it.
So John, here's a harder question for you. Have we seen any evidence on the resilience of co-ops within the current global health crisis?
I think we're not out of it far enough to know. And I know that home care co-ops took a big hit when this happened because of their such an at-risk population for both their staff and their clients, but it's rebounded since then. I think we have to wait and see how this all settles out. In general, though, co-ops tend to be more resilient. Worker co-ops startups tend to last, I think, in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 years versus the average business, which might only last like 3 to 5 years. So, but we'll have to see. I mean, this is such a unique year, but.
All right, my next question. Lauren from RDI has a question, and I'll pass the mic up to her to ask it.
I gave Nate all my backstory, so he's going to let me pose my question. So a number of things that all of you have said have reminded me of this interview that I heard recently about housing development in systematically devalued neighborhoods and communities. And while it's a separate subject, I think some things that came up in that conversation relate here. They talked about the importance of investing in people that live in the places, right? That where we're trying to shift pieces of the economy, the ways in which we build, we add value and keep that wealth local. But they particularly talked about, if we make those investments in place and in an economy, and we don't make those investments in people, we may see unintended consequences from those things. And so I'm curious if, and maybe Ernie and Garrett, since we've had a number of questions for John, you could start. I'm interested in knowing what your thoughts are about the investments we can make in people in these places alongside the things you've talked about already.
I'll jump in. So I just came from a Philanthropy Northwest conference earlier this week, and we had a similar question about, what is necessary in rural communities to see them thrive. And we know that champions matter so much. Local champions that can take a project, guide it through, keep it alive, keep the wind in its sails, draw people to it, just almost live and breathe whatever that project is. And what if that champion doesn't exist? Well, that champion gets an investment into that community, into the people of that community, begins to start to develop those champions. You start to, and the result can be very profound. I go to my own story. At 15 years old, I was homeless, multiple time college dropout before I finally succeeded. And I had success when somebody believed in me, and it was Northwest Area Foundation, along with another foundation here in Eastern Washington, made an investment in me and my vision. And they believed in me. And they believed in what I was trying to accomplish in our tribal community, and really, I mean, it just became one of the single greatest benefits in my life to have that support, and I've continued to work hard and give back to those communities after they've made that investment in me. You feel compelled to return the favor and pass it forward. So champions are critically important.
Yeah, Ernie, I think this was even one of the first bullets in your slides. And I was thinking about it when we were discussing one of the questions earlier, is relationships, right? One of the identities and characteristics of rural communities is you kind of give up or choose not to have your autonomy, your anonymity. There we go. And those relationships are critical. I had a colleague, we have an office in Seattle, and walking up a hill in Seattle, and she was commenting on how she likes to not ever run into anybody she knows, right, without planning it. And I was like, well, good thing you live in a big city, because that's not how rural works. And I think that that's a strength. And I think it was, early on, one of your 3 R's was that relationship. And that is investing in people. It's not necessarily a financial investment in people, but it's taking that time to develop those relationships so you understand what their strengths are, what their hopes are, and you have the amount of compassion and connection with them grows with that. And I just think that you're not going to see that on a balance sheet anywhere, but you are going to find it in success. And when there is, especially in rural communities and in maybe smaller, less corporate settings, but even still, when you dig down into someone who's really successful, you're going to find a base of relationships there that we're invested in. And if I were to, Nate, take sorry to be glum on a very positive presentation, but if I were to think about a negative impact of COVID, it's that's getting strained right now. It's tough to make new relationships. It's tough to strengthen them virtually. And so that's one thing I think as rural communities, will want to keep in mind and keep at the front of mind that when we have the safe ability to get back together again and start breaking bread together again and building those personal relationships in our community, we should probably prioritize it coming out of this so we can come out a little faster, a little stronger.
I'm not sure I have something to add. So,
John, did you want to add something?
no, I think Garrett and Ernie really covered a lot of it. It's and it is about, definitely the role of champions is so important. Finding the people who are willing to see it through, because there is a fair amount of sweat equity in all of this, and that's always the challenge, is getting people to understand that. And but the payoff is really worth it at the end. It's
building on, that what Garrett had just said about the, this sterile Zoom environment that everything feels a little bit scripted. We don't have the opportunity for, just kind of off the cuff conversations. There's no virtual water cooler to gather around. Maybe another generation that is upcoming and really understands how to navigate this space can have those conversations. I find myself a little bit challenged in that regard. So intentionally creating space in this virtual world that we're navigating right now to have just off the cuff conversations, so that, again, I mean, right now, none of us really can have a side conversation other than over in the chat box. That's where those rich exchanges come, and like, oh my God, that's what you're doing. And you all of a sudden realize there's some alignment with what is going on in your idea and my idea, and perhaps your place and my place, that creates an opportunity it's a catalyst for action that Garrett has said that, unfortunately, COVID has kind of put us in this very scripted Zoom world. And so I'd love to see a technology emerge where it allows us to begin to have a bit more off the cuff and organic conversations. But it's yet to come, and hopefully somebody's working on it.
I appreciate that, as I'm just trying to wrestle my cat away right now. So I appreciate the additional challenges of operating in
unscripted moments, right?
Some authenticity, I suppose, and unscripted. Yeah. I like that. But one more question I think that we'll close on, because I think it is a nearly impossible question, and it's a question that touches on all of the work that you guys do. And this is from Amy from RDI. Current economic systems have very short time horizons on return on investment, whereas the things that we're talking about, natural resource management and social cohesion, have much longer time horizons. How do we address this conflict?
I think, well, I don't know. That's going to be the short answer, Amy, and all. But I do wrestle with that. And the Nature Conservancy is a highly philanthropic funded organization. And so a lot of the people who are passionate about our organization are not looking for financial return on investment, but there's still a strong ROI pull and in kind of a short time frame in a lot of people's mind. So some of it is just having those conversations and carrying those conversations of like, what you really want as return, and what are the potential capacities of your return, and how do you want to measure that, and challenge to some extent, you know, that it's not necessarily going to be an X% only over 5 years and then move on to something else. However, I do think there are unique ways to still engage and work within that return on investment complex. That one idea I've kicked around is like realizing what you know, the long-term sustainable profits of coastal forests are. Those numbers can be pretty high. Even, you know, the example I'll give you is that, and I apologize if you can hear the vacuum running. There's too many people in my house to go totally scripted, Ernie. But the city I live in, Montesano, almost, I think it was 100 years ago, they used their water fund money to buy about 5,000 acres of forest, I believe back from Weyerhaeuser, and that was probably Mr. Weyerhaeuser at that time. And they still own about that amount, and they own it outright now. And without a debt load on that forest, it's a longer rotation than industrial. The current forester manages it at about a 45-year rotation. There are trails throughout it. There's all sorts of great benefit. Our water reserves are in there. Most of our drainage for our water source is in that forest. And it nets about $750,000 a year for the city, for the water fund. And that's a great return on any investment right now, right? And so you can capture those long run things and still make that bridge, I think, Amy, and that's what it's going to take, is just being creative. Imagination, we for some reason we lose our imagination about age 12 and feel like it's not of any value after that. And I would challenge us to, close our eyes and think what things could be done. Because there's going to be a solution. I don't hold it right now, but we'll find it.
I would suggest that because of that paradigm that we were talking about with the Venn diagram of the 3 E's, that sustainability paradigm, and the complete imbalance in the service to the economy that we've done, and minimizing the environment and society, and now we're seeing that pushback with the civic unrest and the climate crisis, that we have to learn how to speak in terms of the economy. And I think there's been an attempt at that recently with a report that came out that $16 trillion in earnings was an economic benefit was lost as a result of racial discrimination and marginalization of people of color. I think once we start to begin to equate things into, like what draws people's attention, decision makers, policymakers, what draws their attention, then we can start to see us moving the needle towards, a more truly sustainable fashion. It goes back to a little bit, I mentioned the study for the economic and social impacts of tribes in Washington State as the 7th largest employer, and 70% of those jobs being non-tribal. Once that data comes out and we can start to sit down with policymakers to inform them of the importance, all of a sudden that gets their attention, and they start to work to dedicate some resources to the preservation of the relationship with tribes. Cultural resources. We had a conversation just earlier today. The Washington State Department of Commerce, is challenged with how do we create this understanding that cultural resources truly have value. And if we can figure out, and we're having conversations with some researchers on how to define what's the economic benefit of cultural resources, so that it becomes a little easier again for policymakers to say, that's important, and that's why you need to engage in that space and preserve those cultural resources. So speaking a common language, which unfortunately right now is economy, and putting terms in things in terms of economic benefit, I think is one of our paths forward.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to type in the site here. So I think, part of it, and I may have not remembered the entire question, so forgive me, but I was too busy listening to Ernie and Garrett. I think, many hands make light work. And one of the benefits of the, the cooperative model is it's really patient capital. It's willing to take the time to see returns and to get things moving. Again, the electrification of most of the US wasn't done with the idea that of a quick return. And I do want to mention this, a colleague, the person who is in our legacy videos, just started a new organization called the Main Street Phoenix Project, and it's about creating a holding company that can help small businesses in communities that are in crisis from COVID get through that crisis and come out as employee-owned businesses. And it's a really exciting project. It's just launching, so it's definitely something that it's based out of Boulder, Colorado, but they're expected to be working nationally. And the idea is to try to find a holding company to hold property and to hold space until people can get back on their feet. And I think that's the sort of strategies that can really change the whole discussion when when it's not about getting that return right away.
Well, Ernie, John, Garrett, I see we're running up against our time right now. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this panel and sharing your expertise and the good work that you guys are doing across the Pacific Northwest. And I just want to take a moment and thank everybody for attending this. I want to thank really quick Amy and Allison and Lauren of RDI for helping bring this together and helping organize this session. And a big thanks to all of our sponsors who were able to help us put this thing on. But big thanks again to all of you, the panelists. Allison, you can move the slide forward. To the audience for attending R2R. We really appreciate, we love being able to put this on every 2 years. This is, and it's folks like you that are able to make this happen, especially in such a unique format. So thank you all for coming. Please watch your email inbox for additional wrap-up information and links. But otherwise than that, thank you so much for attending R2R. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Ernie. Thanks, John.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Garrett.
guys.